The German fighters were waiting in the clouds above Berlin, their pilots confident that the American bombers would be exhausted and alone by the time they reached the heart of the Reich. They had seen this pattern dozens of times before, British Spitfires and American Thunderbolts turning back at the German border, leaving the heavy bombers to face the Luftwaffe alone. But on this March morning in 1944, something was different. As the Messerschmitt pilots dove toward the bomber formation, they found themselves face to face with sleek silver fighters that should not have been there, American Mustangs that had somehow traveled 600 miles and still had plenty of fuel to fight. The German pilots who survived that day would tell stories about the Silver Devils that changed everything, but nobody in Berlin High Command wanted to believe them. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Flight Lieutenant James Caldwell stood in the rain at RAF Duxford, watching the new American fighter taxi across the muddy airfield. The aircraft looked wrong to his experienced eyes, too clean, too polished, like something built for racing rather than fighting. Around him, other RAF pilots gathered to inspect the newcomer, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright skepticism. Caldwell had been flying Spitfires since 1940, had fought in the Battle of Britain, had seen friends die in burning cockpits over the English Channel. He knew what a real fighter looked like, and this American creation did not inspire confidence. The P-51 Mustang came to a stop near the dispersal hut, its Allison engine coughing and sputtering in the damp English weather. The pilot who climbed out was a young American lieutenant named Robert Chen, fresh from training in California and clearly uncomfortable in the perpetual drizzle that defined English springtime. He walked over to the group of British pilots with an eager smile that reminded Caldwell of every optimistic young flyer who had arrived at the squadron before learning what war really meant. "Morning, gentlemen," Chen said, his American accent thick and unmistakable. "Captain Patterson sent me over to give you folks a demonstration of what this bird can do. She's fast, handles like a dream, and the visibility from that bubble canopy is outstanding." Squadron leader Victor Pemberton stepped forward, his uniform crisp despite the weather, his mustache perfectly trimmed in the style of RAF officers who had learned their trade in the previous war. He circled the Mustang slowly, running his hand along the metal skin, examining the lines with the critical eye of someone who had seen too many promising designs fail in actual combat. The American fighter was indeed beautiful in its way, with smooth contours and an elegance that suggested speed, but beauty meant nothing when German cannon shells started flying. "Impressive piece of engineering," Pemberton said diplomatically, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But tell me, Lieutenant, how does she perform above 20,000 feet? Because that's where the real fighting happens, and from what I've heard, your Allison engine loses power rather dramatically at altitude." Chen's smile faltered slightly. He had heard the same criticisms during training, had felt the Mustang's performance drop off as he climbed higher into the thin air where bombers and their escorts operated. The early Mustangs were reconnaissance aircraft, fast and maneuverable at low altitude, but lacking the high-altitude performance needed for escort duty. It was a limitation that the American designers were still working to overcome, but for now, it meant that the P-51 was relegated to ground attack missions and low-level reconnaissance work, rather than the crucial bomber escort role. "She's being fitted with a new engine," Chen explained, trying to keep the defensiveness out of his voice. "The Rolls-Royce Merlin, same engine that powers your Spitfires. The test results from the States show incredible improvements in high-altitude performance." Caldwell exchanged glances with the other pilots, and several of them smirked. The idea of putting a British engine into an American airframe struck them as an admission of failure, proof that the Americans could not build a proper fighter without British help. It confirmed what many of them already believed, that American aviation technology was flashy and fast, but fundamentally unsuited for the brutal realities of European air combat. "So, what you're saying," Caldwell said slowly, "is that your American fighter needs a British engine to actually fight Germans?" The other pilots laughed, and Chen's face reddened. He wanted to defend the Mustang, to explain that the combination of American airframe design and British engine technology would create something revolutionary, but he could see that these veterans had already made up their minds. They looked at him and saw an untested pilot flying an untested aircraft, while they were men who had been fighting and dying in European skies for years. Their skepticism was not personal. It was earned through bitter experience with aircraft that promised much and delivered little when lives depended on performance. The demonstration flight that afternoon did nothing to change their opinions. Chen took the Mustang up and showed off its speed and maneuverability at low altitude, performing tight turns and high-speed passes that would have been impressive at an air show. But everyone watching knew that low-altitude performance meant little in the strategic air war over Europe. The real battle was being fought at 25,000 feet and higher, where American B-17 and B-24 bombers struggled to reach their targets through walls of German flak and swarms of enemy fighters. The P-51, for all its grace and speed down low, could not help them up there where it mattered. Over the following months, more Mustangs arrived in England, and more RAF pilots formed the same opinion. The aircraft was fast, it was pretty, but it was not a serious weapon for serious combat. The Americans seemed to have built a sports plane, something for racing and showing off, rather than a tool for the grinding attrition of bomber escort duty. The RAF stuck with their Spitfires, which could at least reach the bombers' altitude even if they lacked the range to escort them deep into Germany. The Americans flew their P-47s, rugged thunderbolts that could take punishment and dish it out, but also lacked the range for deep penetration missions. The problem of bomber escort haunted Allied air commanders throughout 1943. Every daylight raid into Germany became a calculated risk, balancing the strategic value of targets against the horrific losses sustained by unescorted bombers. The 8th Air Force lost hundreds of heavy bombers and thousands of trained crewmen, shot down by German fighters that attacked with impunity once the short-range escorts turned back. Some raids lost more than 20% of the attacking force, losses that would have been unsustainable if not for America's massive industrial capacity to replace aircraft and train new crews. Caldwell saw the results firsthand whenever he flew escort missions. The Spitfires would accompany the bombers as far as the German border, then turn back when their fuel ran low, leaving the big lumbering bombers to face the Luftwaffe alone. He would watch them continue eastward into Germany, knowing that many of those aircraft would never return, that their crews would die in burning wreckage or freeze to death, falling through 30,000 feet of empty air. It was the mathematics of air warfare, brutal and unforgiving, and everyone involved understood that the side which could sustain losses longer would eventually win. Then, in December of 1943, everything changed. The first Merlin engine Mustangs arrived in England, and suddenly the American sports plane became something entirely different. The Packard-built Rolls, Royce Merlin transformed the P-51 from a low-altitude reconnaissance aircraft into a high-performance fighter that could operate effectively at any altitude. More importantly, the Mustang's clean aerodynamic design and efficient fuel consumption gave it unprecedented range. With drop tanks, the P-51 could fly to Berlin and back, something no other Allied fighter could do. Caldwell first encountered the new Mustangs at a briefing in January of 1944. An American colonel named Marcus Brennan stood at the front of the room, pointing to a map of Germany covered with red lines showing fighter ranges. The Spitfire's range stopped at the German border. The Thunderbolt's range extended perhaps 50 miles further, but the Mustang's range went all the way to Berlin, Prague, Munich, anywhere the bombers needed to go. It seemed impossible, too good to be true, another American promise that would fail in actual combat conditions. "Gentlemen," Brennan said, his voice carrying the flat accent of the American Midwest, "we're going to change how this war is fought. Starting next month, P-51 groups will provide continuous escort for heavy bomber missions all the way to the target and back. The Luftwaffe has gotten used to attacking our bombers after the escorts turn back. That's over. From now on, every bomber will have fighters with them from takeoff to landing." Pemberton raised his hand, his skepticism evident in his expression. "Colonel, with all due respect, we've heard these promises before. Extended range tanks, fighter relay systems, all of it sounds brilliant in briefing rooms but falls apart over Germany. What makes you think your Mustangs will be any different?" Brennan smiled, and Caldwell noticed that, unlike the young lieutenant who had demonstrated the early Mustang months earlier, this officer had the confidence of someone who knew exactly what his aircraft could do. "Because we've already done it, squadron leader. Last week, a squadron of Mustangs escorted bombers to Munster and back, 350 miles each way. Not a single bomber was lost to fighters. The Germans didn't know what hit them." The room erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations. If the claim was true, if American fighters could actually escort bombers to deep targets and return with fuel to spare, it would revolutionize the air war. No longer would bombers be forced to run a gauntlet of enemy fighters while their escorts watched helplessly from hundreds of miles away. For the first time since daylight bombing began, the heavy bombers would have protection throughout their entire mission. But claims made in briefing rooms and actual combat performance were different things, and the British pilots remained skeptical. They had seen too many wonder weapons fail, too many brilliant strategies collapse under the harsh realities of combat. The proof would come in the skies over Germany, not in confident presentations by American colonels. The proof came on March 6, 1944, when the 8th Air Force launched its first raid on Berlin. Over 600 heavy bombers took off from English airfields, bound for the German capital, and for the first time, they would have fighter escort all the way to the target. Caldwell was not part of the mission. His Spitfire squadron was assigned to coastal patrol that day, but he listened to the radio reports and spoke with American pilots who returned from the raid. Their stories seemed too incredible to believe. Captain Raymond Foster of the 354th Fighter Group described the moment when his flight of Mustangs reached Berlin airspace. The Germans came up expecting to find bombers alone, like always. They set up their attack formations, started their runs, then suddenly they're getting hit by fighters that shouldn't be there. We were fresh, full of ammunition, and we had been waiting for them. The whole German battle plan fell apart because they couldn't believe we had the range to reach Berlin. The numbers told their own story. Of the 657 heavy bombers that attacked Berlin that day, only 69 were lost, most too flak rather than fighters. Previous raids of similar size and distance had lost twice or three times that many aircraft. The Mustang pilots claimed 69 German fighters destroyed, though post-war analysis would revise that number downward as multiple pilots often claimed the same kill. But the exact score mattered less than the fundamental shift in the strategic balance. For the first time, Allied fighters could go anywhere German fighters could go, and the Luftwaffe's free hunting ground over Germany was closed forever. Caldwell met Foster at a pub in Cambridge a week after the Berlin raid. The American pilot was younger than Caldwell had expected, perhaps 23 years old, with the easy confidence of someone who had not yet been truly tested by war's worst moments. They sat in a corner booth, drinking bitter English beer that Foster clearly did not enjoy but drank anyway out of politeness. Outside, the late winter rain continued its eternal drumming on the blackout curtains. "You have to understand," Foster said, leaning forward with the enthusiasm of someone who needed to share his experience with someone who could understand it. "We weren't supposed to be there. Every German pilot who came up that day was expecting exhausted bombers and clear skies. Instead, they got fighters that had traveled 600 miles and still had fight in them. You could see the confusion in their tactics. They didn't know whether to attack the bombers or engage us, and that hesitation cost them." Caldwell swirled his beer, considering. He had flown enough combat missions to know that confusion and hesitation in air combat usually meant death. Pilots who had to think instead of react ended up in smoking craters or floating down on parachutes into enemy territory. If the Mustangs had genuinely surprised the Germans, had disrupted their established attack patterns, it would take weeks or months for the Luftwaffe to develop new tactics. And in those weeks, the strategic bombing campaign would have a freedom of action it had never enjoyed before. "How much fuel did you have left when you landed?" Caldwell asked, testing the story with the practical question that every fighter pilot understood. "About 40 minutes, Foster admitted. "Enough to make it home with some margin for error. The trick is fuel management. We run lean cruising to and from the target, only go to full power when we're actually fighting. The external tanks give us the range we need, and once they're empty, we drop them and have a clean fighter again. The engineers figured out that the Mustang's aerodynamics are efficient enough that we can fly further on less fuel than any other fighter in service." It made sense from an engineering perspective. Caldwell had seen the Mustang's smooth lines, had noticed the laminar flow wing design that reduced drag, had heard about the American obsession with range and efficiency in aircraft design. What had seemed like aesthetic choices, making the aircraft pretty rather than practical, turned out to be deliberate engineering decisions that gave the Mustang capabilities no other fighter possessed. The British pilots had been so focused on traditional fighter characteristics like climb rate and turn radius that they had missed the revolutionary aspect of the American design. Over the following months, the Mustang proved itself again and again. Berlin raids became routine rather than suicide missions. Bombers penetrated deep into Germany with fighter escort all the way to the target and back. Luftwaffe losses mounted as their fighters were forced to engage enemy escorts at every stage of bomber missions, rather than waiting to attack unescorted formations. The entire calculus of the strategic air war shifted in favor of the Allies, and the humble Mustang that British pilots had mocked became the most feared aircraft in European skies. Caldwell finally flew in a Mustang in April of 1944, when the Americans offered to let RAF pilots experience the aircraft firsthand. He approached the sleek silver fighter with new respect, climbing into the cockpit and feeling immediately at home despite the American instruments and unfamiliar controls. The bubble canopy gave him visibility that his Spitfire could never match, and when he fired up the Merlin engine, the familiar British rumble reassured him that this was indeed a serious fighting machine rather than an American toy. The test flight opened his eyes to what the Mustang could do. It was fast, faster than anything he had flown before, yet still maneuverable enough to dogfight with German fighters. The controls were light and responsive, the aircraft seemed to anticipate his intentions, and the fuel gauges showed consumption rates that confirmed the Mustang's incredible range. He climbed to 30,000 feet and found the engine still pulling strong, then dove back down and felt the airframe remain solid and stable through speeds that would have made a Spitfire shake itself apart. This was not a sports plane or a reconnaissance aircraft. This was a weapon designed to dominate the skies over Europe. When he landed and climbed out of the cockpit, Foster was waiting with a knowing smile. Different from what you expected? Caldwell nodded slowly, still processing the experience. I was wrong, he said simply. We all were. This changes everything. It already has, Foster replied. The Germans know it too. Their pilots are getting more cautious, more defensive. They used to attack bomber formations with confidence because they knew they only had to survive until our escorts ran out of fuel. Now they know we'll be there the whole time, and it's making them think twice about pressing attacks. The psychological aspect of air warfare could not be measured in kill ratios or loss rates, but it mattered enormously. German fighter pilots who had once been aggressive hunters were becoming cautious defenders, worried more about survival than about destroying bombers. The Luftwaffe's tactical doctrine, built around massed fighter attacks on unescorted bomber formations, was obsolete. They were fighting the wrong war with the wrong tactics, and every day the situation grew worse for them, as more Mustang groups arrived in England and began flying escort missions. Pemberton organized a formal evaluation of the Mustang in May, bringing together RAF pilots from multiple squadrons to compare the American fighter against British designs. They flew mock dogfights, tested fuel consumption, evaluated high-altitude performance, and examined maintenance requirements. The conclusion was unanimous. The Mustang was superior to any British fighter in the escort role, and probably superior in most other roles as well. It was a bitter pill for British pride to swallow, but the evidence was overwhelming. The Americans got it right, Pemberton admitted during the final briefing, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and frustration. They built an aircraft for a specific strategic purpose, long-range bomber escort, and they succeeded beyond anything we could have achieved. Our Spitfire is still an excellent interceptor, perhaps the best in the world for defending British airspace. But for the offensive air war over Europe, the Mustang is simply better. The admission represented a fundamental shift in British attitudes toward American aviation technology. The RAF had always considered itself superior to any air force in the world, had won the Battle of Britain through skill and courage, had pioneered tactics and techniques that other nations copied. But the Mustang proved that the Americans could innovate too, could solve problems that British designers had considered unsolvable. The distance from England to Berlin was too far for any fighter to escort bombers, except that the Americans had built a fighter that could do exactly that. By June of 1944, as Allied forces invaded Normandy and began the liberation of Europe, the Mustang dominated the skies over Germany. Luftwaffe pilots who had once been confident in their ability to intercept bomber formations now faced overwhelming odds. American and British bombers struck targets throughout the Reich with relative impunity, destroying oil refineries, aircraft factories, and transportation networks that the German war machine needed to continue fighting. The Mustang had not won the air war alone, but it had made victory possible by solving the problem of long-range escort. German pilots developed a grudging respect for the silver American fighters. Hauptmann Wolfgang Krüger, a veteran Luftwaffe ace with 47 confirmed victories, was shot down by a Mustang in July of 1944. He survived the encounter and was captured by advancing American forces. During his interrogation, he spoke candidly about the impact the P-51 had on German fighter tactics and morale. "When we first heard that American fighters were appearing over Berlin, we did not believe it," Krüger said through an interpreter. "The distance was impossible, but then we saw them ourselves, these silver aircraft that should not have been there. They were fast, well-armed, and their pilots were aggressive. Worse, they were always there. Every mission, every attack on the bombers, we faced Mustangs. There was no longer any safe hunting ground where we could attack bombers without fighter opposition." The psychological effect was devastating. Our younger pilots especially became demoralized because they knew that every mission would involve fighting against superior numbers of enemy fighters. The testimony confirmed what Allied intelligence had suspected. The Mustang had broken the back of the Luftwaffe, not through any single decisive battle, but through relentless presence. German fighter pilots could no longer choose when and where to fight, could no longer avoid combat until conditions favored them. The Mustang forced them to fight on Allied terms, and the grinding attrition of that constant combat destroyed the Luftwaffe's effectiveness as a fighting force. Foster was killed in August of 1944, shot down during a strafing run on a German airfield in France. He had survived 200 combat missions, had been one of the first pilots to escort bombers all the way to Berlin, had seen the Mustang transform from mocked outsider to feared legend. Caldwell learned of his death from a terse casualty report and felt the familiar hollowness that came with losing someone who had become a friend despite the short time they had known each other. The war consumed people, turned them into statistics and casualty reports, and there was nothing anyone could do except continue fighting and hope they would not be the next name on the list. The final months of 1944 saw the air war reach its crescendo. Allied bombers struck German cities and industrial targets with increasing frequency and decreasing losses. The Luftwaffe, starved of fuel and replacement aircraft, could mount only token resistance. Mustangs roamed freely over Germany, strafing trains and vehicles, attacking airfields, and hunting the few remaining German fighters that dared to take off. The aircraft that British pilots had dismissed as an American sports plane had become the symbol of Allied air supremacy, and German civilians learned to fear the sight of silver fighters in the sky. Caldwell flew his last combat mission in November, escorting bombers in his Spitfire during a raid on Hamburg. He flew alongside Mustangs, watching them work with professional admiration. They moved with confidence and precision, veterans who knew their aircraft and their mission. When German fighters appeared, the Mustangs engaged them aggressively, protecting the bombers with skill and courage. The mission was a success. The bombers hit their targets and returned safely. And Caldwell realized that this had become routine rather than exceptional. The desperate battles of earlier years, when every raid was a gamble and losses were catastrophic, belonged to history now. After the mission, Caldwell walked across the airfield to where the American Mustangs were parked. He stood in front of one of the silver fighters, studying its lines with new appreciation. The aircraft that had seemed wrong when he first saw it now looked exactly right, every curve and angle serving a purpose, every design choice contributing to its revolutionary performance. The British pilots who had mocked it had been blinded by tradition and assumption, unable to see that the Americans had approached fighter design from a completely different perspective and created something genuinely new. A young American pilot approached, perhaps 19 years old, fresh-faced and eager. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, seeing Caldwell's RAF uniform. "Just admiring your aircraft," Caldwell replied. "She's quite something." The young pilot grinned with pride. "Best fighter in the world, sir. We're escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something people said was impossible just a year ago." Caldwell nodded, thinking about his own skepticism, about all the British pilots who had dismissed the Mustang as inadequate. "Yes," he said quietly, People said a lot of things. Turned out they were wrong. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945, and the Mustang's role in achieving that victory was undeniable. Post-war analysis showed that the introduction of long-range fighter escort had been decisive in winning the air war over Germany. The Mustang had not been the only factor. The courage of bomber crews and the massive industrial capacity of the United States played crucial roles as well. But the P-51 had solved the fundamental problem that had threatened to make strategic bombing unsustainable, the problem of protecting bombers throughout their entire mission profile. Caldwell remained in the RAF after the war, eventually reaching the rank of wing commander before retiring in 1958. He watched as jet fighters replaced propeller-driven aircraft, as air warfare evolved beyond anything he would have imagined during the dark days of 1940. But he never forgot the lesson of the Mustang, that sometimes the most revolutionary solutions came from unexpected sources, that dismissing new ideas because they challenged conventional wisdom could be a fatal mistake. In 1962, Caldwell attended an air show in California where vintage warbirds performed for enthusiastic crowds. A restored P-51 Mustang took to the sky, its silver skin gleaming in the California sun, its Merlin engine roaring with power. He watched it perform aerobatics, demonstrating the speed and agility that had made it such a formidable weapon. And he felt a complex mixture of emotions. Pride that he had lived through those desperate years and survived. Regret for the friends who had not. Respect for the aircraft and the men who had flown it into combat. And gratitude that he had been able to recognize his own mistake and appreciate the Mustang for what it truly was. After the show, Caldwell spoke with the pilot who had flown the restored Mustang. They traded stories about flying the iconic fighter, comparing experiences separated by decades but united by the common bond of having trusted their lives to that aircraft. The pilot mentioned that he was the son of an 8th Air Force pilot who had flown Mustangs over Germany, one of the men who had fought in those desperate air battles that changed the course of the war. "My father always said the Mustang saved his life," the pilot said. "He flew B-17 bombers before transferring to fighters, saw how the raids were going before we had long-range escorts. He said half his friends died on those missions, shot down by German fighters after our escorts turned back. The Mustang changed all that. Gave the bomber crews a chance to survive and complete their missions." Caldwell nodded, understanding. "It changed the entire war. The Germans could have held out much longer if we hadn't been able to destroy their industrial capacity through strategic bombing, and we couldn't have done that without bomber escort. The Mustang made victory possible." They stood together watching the aircraft taxi back toward the hangars, this beautiful machine that had been built for war, but now existed only as a memory of those desperate times. The Mustang had started as an afterthought, a low-priority project that few people believed would amount to anything significant. British pilots had mocked it, American commanders had doubted it, and German intelligence had dismissed it as just another Allied fighter with limited capabilities. They had all been wrong, spectacularly and completely wrong. The transformation of the P-51 from rejected outsider to legendary fighter represented something larger than just the success of one aircraft design. It showed how innovation could come from unexpected places, how combining technologies from different sources could create something revolutionary, and how initial skepticism could blind people to genuine breakthroughs. The British engine in the American airframe had been mocked as an admission of failure, but it turned out to be a perfect combination that created the most effective fighter of the war. Caldwell returned to England carrying with him renewed appreciation for the Mustang and what it represented. He gave lectures at RAF Staff College, teaching new generations of officers about the importance of keeping an open mind about new technologies and new approaches to old problems. He used the story of the Mustang as a cautionary tale about the dangers of dismissing innovations simply because they challenged conventional wisdom or came from unexpected sources. In his final years, as age and illness confined him to a wheelchair, Caldwell would often look at a photograph on his wall showing a formation of Mustangs escorting heavy bombers over Germany. The image captured perfectly what the P-51 had meant to the air war: protection and power, range and reliability, the answer to a problem that had seemed unsolvable. He had been privileged to witness that revolution firsthand, to fly the aircraft that changed everything, to see how one brilliant design could alter the course of history. The British pilots who had mocked the American P-51 learned a lesson that transcended aviation and warfare. They learned that pride and tradition, while valuable, could also blind people to progress and innovation. They learned that solutions to complex problems sometimes came from unexpected directions and required combining ideas from multiple sources. Most importantly, they learned that being wrong was not a weakness if one had the courage to admit the mistake and learn from it. The Mustang flew on in history and memory, its silver wings representing a turning point in the Second World War and in aviation history. The aircraft that should not have worked, the fighter that British veterans dismissed as an American sports plane, had proven itself over the skies of Berlin and beyond. It had saved countless lives, changed the strategic balance of the war, and earned its place among the most significant military aircraft ever built. And it had taught everyone who witnessed its success that sometimes the most important innovations came from those willing to challenge conventional wisdom and try something new, even when the experts said it could not be done. The story of the P-51 Mustang lived on as a reminder that progress required both technical innovation and the wisdom to recognize breakthrough ideas when they appeared, even if they came wrapped in unexpected packages. The British pilots who had initially mocked the American fighter eventually became its strongest advocates. Having learned through hard experience that true excellence transcended national pride and conventional thinking. In the end, the Mustang belonged not to Britain or America alone, but to all those who understood that victory required embracing the best ideas regardless of their origin, and that sometimes the most revolutionary weapons came from the most unlikely sources.